All right. Hello, everyone. Our project focuses on cancer rates in different protein sources. And in our group, we have Kiera, Megan, myself, and Quentin. So first off, why do we want to study the effects of different kinds of protein on cancer? Well, in this ongoing quest to find ways to lose weight, research has found that diets high in protein were better for weight loss, losing fat mass specifically, and also preserving lean muscle mass. High protein diets are also an essential part of the diet for anyone trying to put on muscle, like strength athletes and bodybuilders. Although short-term effects of these high protein diets are very well studied and well understood, there's actually very little known about the long-term effects of these diets. We do, however, know that the amino acid structure is quite different between plant and animal sources of protein. With that as well, the macro and micronutrient composition of these different sources of protein are very different. For instance, things like the presence of fiber. These differences have differential health effects. And we also know that ecological studies have reported that increased animal protein is positively correlated with cardiovascular disease as well as cancer.
So when we're looking at different types of protein in our diets, we know that certain kinds of meats are carcinogenic. So in 2015, the IARC was urged to look over the epidemiological data that suggested that red meat and processed meats are associated with increased risks of certain cancers. This resulted in red meat being classified as a group 2 carcinogen, meaning that it is possibly or probably carcinogenic to humans. This is because when red meats are brought up to high temperatures, the chemical reaction produces polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs. Also, when red meat is browned, it goes through a process called the Maillard reaction. One of the intermediaries of the Maillard reaction is acrylamide, which the IARC, the NTP, and the EPA have considered a probable carcinogen. Processed meats were also classified as a group 1 carcinogen, meaning that following epidemiological data, it suggested increased amounts or increased risks in certain types of cancers. Preserved meats also have high amounts of sodium nitrate, which is a preservative that is known to decrease the efficiency of gas exchange in blood cells and increase the risk of heart disease by making your arteries more rigid.
So while we were looking at meat protein sources, it's also important to consider vegetable protein sources and their cancer risks. So cruciferous vegetables were shown to decrease cancer risk, and these cruciferous vegetables were vegetables such as arugula, bok choy, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, kale, and radishes. These cruciferous vegetables are rich in nutrients, including several carotenoids such as beta carotene, and they contain large amounts of vitamin C, E, and K. These types of vegetables were also shown to contain active compounds such as indoles and isothiocyanates, which are released during digestion. These compounds were also shown to protect cells from DNA damage, inactivate carcinogens, and induce cell death or apoptosis. They also have several antiviral, antibacterial effects. These vegetables were also shown to have anti-inflammatory effects as well. Something that was also very notable was that these vegetables can inhibit tumor blood vessel formation or angiogenesis, and they can also inhibit tumor cell migration. Next slide.
All right. So looking at cancer studies as a whole, there was an expert panel of a systematic review by the World Cancer Research Fund / American Institute for Cancer Research. And they concluded that both red and processed meats are convincing causes of colorectal cancer. There's also some evidence to suggest that high intakes of red and processed meats increase risk for cancers of the esophagus, stomach, pancreas, lung, endometrium, and prostate. But even with all this evidence, there are a few prospective studies that focus on the long-term health effects of vegetarians and cancer incidences specifically. And these studies these studies also don't use recruitment methods that ensure considerable numbers of vegetarian participants.
This leads to our question of, does cancer rate change based on the primary protein source, whether that is meat, vegetarian, or pescatarian? Data in 2007 was published from a case control study that questioned 3 different common dietary clusters: a high fruit and low meat cluster, a high vegetable, moderate meat cluster, and a high meat cluster, and its relationship with colorectal adenomas. After being adjusted for age, sex, race, BMI, smoking, and NSAID use and alcohol use, they found statistically significant increases in colorectal adenomas in those individuals who are eating high vegetable, moderate meat, and high meat diets. These findings suggest that eating less meat and higher amounts of fruits can decrease the risk of colorectal adenomas.
So this study is reported from a pool analysis of data from 2 prospective studies conducted in the UK. And it followed a total of 32,403 meat eaters, 8,500 non-meat eaters who also ate fish, which this study called fish eaters, and 20,000 vegetarians. And the study did a 12-year follow-up period to see if any of these participants developed cancer. So what this study found was that stomach cancer risk differed significantly. It was much lower in vegetarians than in meat eaters, and non-significantly lower in fish eaters. It also found that cervical cancer was significantly higher in vegetarians compared to meat eaters, and not significantly higher in all fish eaters. Ovarian cancer was also significantly lower in fish eaters compared to meat eaters. Prostate cancer had no significant difference, and bladder cancer was also lower in vegetarians. Colorectal cancer also was shown to have no significant difference. And in general, the total cancer incidence was significantly lower in fish eaters and vegetarian diets compared to meat diets. This figure also showed that overall total cancers were lower in fish and vegetarian diets compared to meat eaters. And this data would suggest that diet, in particular the types of proteins people consume, can increase or decrease the risk of developing cancers.
And so this next figure is from a study that looked at cause and cancer-specific mortality rates based on protein consumption. It was a cohort prospective study with 61,595 registered residents who were aged 40 to 59 years old in 1990, and then 78,825 individuals between the ages of 40 to 69 were then added in 1993. The residents in question were administered a baseline survey, which had questionnaires to assess their diet and lifestyle factors, and they had follow-up surveys every 5 years. Exclusion factors included history of cancer, stroke, ischemic heart disease, or renal disease, extreme caloric intake, and also being in the top 0.1 percentile of protein intake. What you can see in the figure is the hazard ratios for mortality associated with an isocaloric substitution of 3% energy from plant protein for animal protein from various sources. So essentially what's happening here is the primary protein source is listed and they replace 3% of the total caloric intake from that protein source with a plant protein, and sort of looked at how the hazard rate of mortality would change. The data here is adjusted for total energy, percentage of energy from fats and carbohydrates, sex, BMI, smoking, alcohol use, physical activity, occupation status, job status, intake of green tea, and also intake of coffee. The estimated absolute risk reduction, so overall of having that 3% isocaloric substitution with plant protein was 1.92% for cancer-related mortalities. And there was actually a 2.45% reduction when you substitute red meat for a plant-based protein. And it was also found that substitution of red and processed meat with a fish protein was also significantly reduced cancer-related mortality. And you can also see on this right-hand side here, sort of how the movement of the hazard rate is favoring either plant protein or animal protein, in the sense that plant protein is reducing hazard rate while animal protein is increasing hazard rate. Overall, the data from this figure shows that not only does animal protein intake increase incidences of cancer, but it also has a very significant effect on the rate of cancer-based mortalities in individuals.
So in this next study, this study is a focused literature review of controlled trials that began in as early as the 1950s, and the authors independently extracted data from all these trials, focusing on Mediterranean diet and cancer risks. In this table, we see the summary of studies reviewed as well as the cancer type. We can see the outcomes of each study where OR represents odds ratio and HR as hazard ratio. And it's also noted when an outcome is not significant, as well as commentary made by the authors. There are specific examples in these sources that emphasize the concept of culturally specific diets positively affecting health, but it's not shown directly through the figure. For instance, in one of their studies reviewed, it was found that the frequency of spicy food intake is associated with the reduced risk of mortality in the Chinese population, where culturally they consume higher amounts of chili. Overall, the study concluded that there is evidence to suggest that adhering to a Mediterranean diet results in a lower risk of cancer, where Mediterranean diet consists of plant-based foods such as fruits, vegetables, cereals, legumes, nuts, seeds, and olive oil. Dairy products have a recommended low consumption of milk and high of cheese and yogurt, and moderate consumption of fish, eggs, and recommended low amounts of consumption of red meat, as well as recommended moderate consumption of wine with meals. So all in all, we can connect this back to our essential question, because seeing that these results suggest that cancer rates are affected by not only the protein source, but also the amount consumed.
So after reviewing all these studies and analyzing the figures, in summary, in observing British diets, total cancer incidences were found to be significantly lower in fish and vegetarian diets compared to meat diets.
And similarly to the British diet, in the Japanese cancer mortality hazard rates were significantly lower when meat protein-based diets were replaced in part with vegetable protein-based diets, and even when red meat was replaced with fish-based diets as well.
We also see this trend in the Mediterranean diet, where there's a lower risk of cancer, where the diet emphasizes plant-based foods with recommended moderation of consumption of meats, including fish and eggs.
And we also found that diets with high and moderate amounts of meat were found to have increased rates of colorectal cancer when compared to diets of high amounts of fruit and low amounts of meat.
So in conclusion, our studies agree with one another, suggesting that increased red meat consumption is linked to increased cancer risk of various cancers. Going back to our essential question, does cancer rate change based on primary protein source, which are meat, vegetarian, pescatarian based? The data found supports this hypothesis that primary protein source consumption does have an effect on cancer risks, where pescatarian and vegetarian based diets trend similarly in that there are lower rates of cancer associated with these diets.
It is also important. It is also important to understand the health effects that our diets have on our bodies. Especially living in Western societies, red meats are a very significant portion of the average American diet. And since cancer is such a prevalent health issue, we can safely assume most daily factors play a role in cancer risk, which would include the consumption of proteins.
And in the future, something that we would like to investigate would be the effect of the vegan diet on cancer rate. This was something that we didn't really find in a lot of the data, and we think that it would be an interesting thing to look at, considering that it's another popular diet that has come up within the past couple decades.
And then another thing we'd like to see investigated is the effect of fatty meat versus lean meat on cancer rate. Of course, with this data and saying animal proteins there's a higher hazard rate of getting cancer with eating an animal protein. Animal protein is so essential to certain people's diet and at large that cutting out animal protein completely is not as feasible as maybe we would like it to be. So sort of highlighting that in further research could point out safer kinds of animal protein, and so overall reducing that cancer risk. And then also sort of trying to get to a more complete picture of different aspects of our diet and how it affects cancer rate. We were thinking about investigating effects of salt and sugar on cancer rate. Those two are also very prominent in especially modern diets. There's sugar and salt in everything in very elevated amounts as well. And so, yeah, really just trying to investigate how all different parts of our diet affect on how they all affect cancer rate and not just necessarily the protein. And then with that, here are our references. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you, everyone.